Hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining this seminar today. Before we start, I would like to inform that we are being recorded and live streamed on YouTube right now. So if you do not want to be recorded, I suggest you exit Zoom and join the talk through YouTube. Um, Feel free to join us back on Zoom after 1 p.m. ET, which will not be recorded. And that time we'll be having a participant-driven discussion. So I'll just pause for a few seconds if people in case want to leave right now and join YouTube. Awesome. So just a quick note about what our Trustworthy ML Initiative is. We are a group of people who are interested in a broad area of research that encompasses different aspects of trustworthy machine learning. Our initiative has multiple goals. Firstly, we want to make the resources widely available publicly. So we have a curated list of resources on our website. I request everyone to kindly check that out. Along with that, we provide platform for early career researchers, and we have Rising Star Spotlight Talks frequently in our seminar series. We have an active Twitter thread to engage discussions and debate along the lines of trustworthy ML. And then in the near future, we hope to organize symposiums and workshops to strengthen the trustworthy community. So back to today's agenda. Today we have Gautam Kamath, whose talk will be going from 12 to 12:45 p.m. ET. Kindly submit your questions and upvote them during the talk through your Zoom Q&A tool. From 12:45 to 1 p.m. ET, we'll having a Q&A session with a moderated chat with the speaker. We'll take a 5 minutes break after that 1 p.m. ET time, and then we'll reconvene for a participant-driven discussion at 1:05. So with that being said, I would now like to introduce Dr. Gautam Kamath. He's an assistant professor at the University of Waterloo, Cheriton School of Computer Science, and a faculty affiliate at Wexner Institute. He's mostly interested in principled methods for statistics and machine learning, with a focus on settings which are common in modern data analysis. He was a Microsoft Research Fellow at the Simons Institute for the Theory of Computing for the fall of 2018 semester program on Foundations of Data Science and Spring 2019 semester program. Before that, he completed his PhD at MIT, affiliated with the Theory of Computing group at CSAIL. I would now like to give the floor to Gautam. Kindly take it away.
Thank you so much, Chirag. 1 sec, let me share screen. Cool. This should be visible, I guess. Yeah, first of all, I'd like to say thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and thank you for organizing what you organize, in the sense that I think one of the best parts about the pandemic, I mean, it's really terrible and bad in many ways, of course, but I think it's really been inspiring how so many people have stepped up and to create great communities and content online. And I'd say the TrustML sort of organization, I guess you'd call it, has done, I think, some of the best of this in the terms of not only having an awesome seminar of speakers, but also a lot of just generally building a community, which is something I personally value a lot. So hats off to them. Yeah, so today I'm going to tell you about a work called CoinPress on practical private estimation. This is joint work with Sourav Biswas, who's an undergrad at University of Waterloo, Yihe Dong, who's at Microsoft, and Jonathan Ullman, who's a faculty at Northeastern University. This is kind of a culmination, it's been a culmination so far of a research agenda I have, which also includes Jerry Lee at Microsoft Research and Vikrant Singhal at Northeastern University. And I'll mention some of their contributions to earlier works in this line later in the talk. And as you said, as sort of encouraged, please ask questions at any time. Like this could be a very, this talk can be, you know, the first 10 slides, and I think I get most of the ideas across, or we can go through all the extensions, but really, yeah, if we ask questions and everyone here learns something, that's like the best outcome. So yeah, without further ado, let's proceed. So let me give a teaser for this talk in one slide. The problem that we're going to be focused on is going to be mean estimation, where we're given a data set, x1 through xn, which is drawn from a distribution, and we want to estimate the mean of the distribution. But the catch is we want to do this privately, and we'll talk a bit more about what we mean by privately. And the interesting thing is, even just for this most basic fundamental question, the first tool in any statistical toolbox, there's going to be a lot of new challenges, which the main one we're going to be focusing on is what I like to call the question, where does my data lie? Which turns out to be a very important question in the private setting. And I'll tell in this talk a practical and general tool for private point estimation and confidence intervals, which will apply to multivariate settings, covariance estimation. And in terms of like more than just being practical, these will also be theoretically principled in the sense that they achieve basically the near optimal sample complexity or rates for private parameter estimation. Now, I just want to say one thing before we continue a bit further. Why mean estimation? Maybe you're all here for, machine learning and you want to see deep learning or something like that. But let me just give sort of a little bit of an argument for why you should maybe start a little bit slower and try to solve the fundamental question before jumping in and trying to solve everything all at once. Yeah, I think my research agenda generally starts from trying to identify the simplest possible problem that we can't solve and trying to solve that. And generally, this comes down to mean estimation. Some other people have different things. For example, say starting at just linear regression and saying something for that. But the reason why this is, I think, a good thing to do is generally you can actually understand something when you start at a very simple setting. And this is very valuable in research in the sense that often, if you're doing something where you don't really actually fundamentally understand what's going on, you might just try something, it doesn't work, you don't know why. You try something else, it doesn't work, you don't know why. You try something else, it does work, and okay, you got lucky. But I think understanding sort of the fundamentals is better in terms of giving you some way to actually search in an intelligent way. And I just like to say maybe your end goal is to try to do something on like more complicated machine learning settings. I just have to say that patience. For example, in something I'm not going to talk about today, I've done also work in, say, robustness to data poisoning type attacks. I wrote 3 papers on private mean estimation, which took me the course of maybe like 2 years to figure all that out. And then finally from there, I went to maybe more modern machine learning settings with algorithms which are robust to data poisoning. So I'll say that I think that understanding these simple settings can go a really long way in terms of understanding more complex settings. And you'll learn a lot of things that you didn't actually know before and give you a leg up on the competition in my mind. Okay, so that's sort of my brief pitch on why even study this type of thing in the first place. Let me go into some of the key definitions that we're going to need. In particular, I mentioned that privacy is an important thing. I guess in other talks I've given slides sort of motivating why we need privacy at all. Hopefully, if you're here for a Trustworthy ML talk, you should realize that's very important. I'll just say that often we run statistical analyses on sensitive data, for example, including medical data. And clearly, it would be a bad idea if you ran a study on someone's sensitive medical information and you leaked their condition to the world. That's something they kind of trust you not to do. So therefore, we need to really rethink our fundamental statistical toolkit through a lens of privacy. How do we try to prevent this type of disclosure? And the sort of most accepted rigorous notion of data privacy is that known of differential privacy, which was introduced in 2006 by Dwork, McSherry, Nassim, and Smith. Now, the specifics of the definition that we're going to use are not really too important, but I'll try to get across some of the main points. The idea, I'll describe it first as a kind of a game or a kind of in terms of what's going on, and then I'll describe it as a mathematical definition. But again, it's not really super important. So the idea is the following. You have some algorithm, which you can see in the middle there, mx. Well, m is the algorithm. And the idea is that this is going to be fed in one of 2 different data sets, either x or x prime, where x and x prime differ just in the sense that x prime has one entry changed with respect to x. So you can see there's one additional point in x prime right here. And so one of those 2 is going to get fed into the algorithm, and it's going to produce some sort of output. And now the adversary's goal, based on looking at the output, is to determine whether the data set fed in was either x or x prime. This is kind of very natural because, and the goal of the adversary is to try to figure out which one they're looking at, we can say if they can't figure out which one they're looking at, either x or x prime, then we say the algorithm is differentially private. This is kind of vague. We'll get into like a mathematical definition, but the main idea is because why is this private? Well, if the algorithm or if the adversary can't even tell whether or not you're in the data set, suppose you're this sad-faced individual, if they can't even tell whether you're in the data set, then they have no hope of actually determining more about you in any other way. So this provides quite a strong notion of data privacy. And this is kind of what a lot of people have adopted in practice, including Google, Microsoft, and so on. So more mathematically, I'll state the definition here, where it says an algorithm is epsilon differentially private if for all inputs x and x prime which differ on one entry, we have that essentially the probability distribution of outputs of the algorithm are similar to each other. They're close to each other. Now, let me just say that there's like a more mathematical, like the more precisely it's saying something like this, where there's sort of this multiplicative guarantee. But again, it's not really too important. All you have to think is that the distribution of outputs from the algorithm is close if it was fed in similar data sets. In fact, we're going to use a slightly different notion of differential privacy, one which is called concentrated differential privacy. But if you're, which I'm not even going to formally define, but if you're familiar with differential privacy, then you can think of this as being between pure and approximate differential privacy. If you're not familiar with differential privacy, don't sweat it. Like this is just the main idea, and we're not going to use anything really too more precise to during this talk. All right, I see there's one question. So there's one question: what are other definitions of privacy besides differential privacy? Yeah, that's a. Let me click answer live. This is a great question. I'd say there's many. Okay, before differential privacy, I'd say that there were some notions of privacy which were proposed, which were kind of trying to protect against, say, different types of attacks. Different types of attacks and very sort of ad hoc types of notions. But I would say that differential privacy is kind of what the community has rallied around in terms of this is kind of the best rigorous notion of data privacy. There are many variations in the space. It doesn't refer to just one single definition. For example, I've told you already about pure differential privacy as well as concentrated differential privacy. We're not really going to distinguish between all those. But I'd say that this is kind of been accepted as kind of the way. I know there's some notions which are more popular in the information theory communities, but at least within CS, this is what I think most people have rallied around. If not the specific precise definition, like proving this formally, but at least this style of thinking in terms of trying to understand, say, what we call a type of membership inference type setting. So yeah, great question. I'd say yeah, like the definition is something that we really like in terms of especially people who work in the theory of it. But I'd say more than that, it's I think the style of thinking about attacks, which has been the most valuable. Sure, this is a great question. If there's any other questions, I'm happy to take a few now on the definition. Cool. Without further ado, I'll proceed then. Let me tell you about like the specific notion, like what we're actually going to be looking at in terms of our setting. How does privacy fit into these statistical settings, and what are we doing? So we're imagining the following type of setting. There's some distribution, P, which we don't know, and via random sampling, we generate some sort of data set x1 through xn. This random data set is fed into an algorithm, M, and we get some sort of utility, like it produces some output, and how good this output is measured with respect to the unknown distribution. So it's kind of the statistical setting where we're trying to learn something about the distribution, and we just use this data set as a type of proxy for it. But really the goal is to learn something about the population or the distribution underlying. So there's two desiderata that we generally have in these types of settings. The first is the classic type of desideratum, which is that we want our algorithm to be accurate. That is, stochastically, if the data set is drawn from this unknown distribution, we want to be able to learn something about the distribution. This may require assumptions about p to hold in some cases. For example, maybe we need sometimes that's Gaussian or satisfies some moment bounds. And today we're going to be mostly focusing, I'll mention a few other settings briefly, but today's utility guarantee is basically going to be making sure that the L2 distance between the true mean of the distribution and the estimated mean of the distribution is small. And the second thing, so this is the classic setting. If we just look at one, like, talk to any statistician or machine learning person, and they'll be happy with just one. But the new thing that we're going to do is that the algorithm is private always. What do I mean by always? I mean, recall that I said this sort of setup where the data set is randomly generated. This is sort of where we want to measure our accuracy with respect to. But in terms of the privacy guarantee, we want to kind of forget this thing on the left. We want to forget about the distribution, and we want to say for any worst case data set that we have privacy. And there's a few different reasons why we kind of want this really worst case privacy guarantee. One reason is because that this is kind of, if you're the analyst and you make some assumption about how the data is generated, this could be wrong. In many cases, it's going to be wrong. Like as the aphorism goes, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. In particular, you might have made a mistake when specifying what type of things hold on the distribution. So if you make a mistake as the analyst, you don't necessarily want to sacrifice people's privacy. And you really want a worst case privacy guarantee as a result. There's other more technical reasons, which I'll skip for now. I'll mention that there are some alternative forms of differential privacy, which also try to deal with the case where your data is randomly generated. But I'll mention that this is subject to the caveats before, that perhaps you might be losing some sort of privacy if your assumptions are wrong, or technical things break down in certain cases, which I'm not going to get into. So yeah, those are the two things we want. We want it to be accurate and private. And in terms of privacy, the guarantee that we're going to focus on is, like I said before, epsilon squared concentrated differential privacy, but that's a mouthful. So let's just think we want differential privacy. And the general focus of this talk, and kind of a focus of my research agenda as a whole, is what is the additional cost of privacy? One, so if like the desideratum one is very well understood, because this is what the statisticians have been studying for hundreds of years now, at least 100 years. But two is a fairly new thing to study in addition to one. At the most, it's been studied for like maybe 17 years because 15 years since differential privacy's introduction in 2006. But there's a lot of settings, there's a lot of work to still be done here in terms of things we don't understand. So let me pause for a sec here in case there's any questions about like the sort of setup in privacy and statistics or differential privacy in general. This sort of just laying the stage, and then we'll talk about more specific settings and what we're going to talk about in this talk. Cool. If not, I'll proceed. And I'll try to introduce in this slide the main challenge that we face in differentially private setting, which is not really something which we face in a non-private setting. This is kind of something novel to the setting, which is, I think, rather fundamental phenomenon and something that comes up a lot in all sorts of data analysis. So let me sort of give an example. Suppose we're given a set of female heights, x1 through xn, and the goal is to compute the average height of a female. So I picked just females because I wanted this to be perhaps a nice Gaussian type distribution. That's about it. So you can see it's like this. If I included males and females, then it would be like a mixture. So I just want to keep it very simple. So let's just stick with female heights. And the mathematical question underlying this, oh, sorry, I see there's a question. Sure, I'll get back to this in a bit. Let me maybe, in fact, John, I know you're here, so maybe you can answer that in the chat, because I think, yeah, you can give a good answer to that. Okay, so yeah, essentially the mathematical question underlying here is, again, the same sort of mean estimation question, where we have x1 through xn, which are drawn IID from some unknown distribution p, and we want to estimate the mean of this distribution, mu. So non-privately, this is a very simple question in the sense that you ask any statistician, you ask anyone and they'll know what the answer is. You want to find the mean, just average your data set. Super easy, plug it in, done. Call it a day. If this was non-private, well, this talk would already be done because there's nothing more to do. But we'll see that like under privacy, under the notion of privacy we're considering, it's not as clear. Just because, okay, so let me tell you, this is basically all you'll need to know about differential privacy for this talk, which is the Gaussian mechanism. I won't even, maybe I'll define it more precisely in a slide or two. But the idea is that the Gaussian mechanism, what it does is it adds noise proportional to a statistic's sensitivity. That is, consider just changing one data point in your data set. And how much can that change the statistic? Well, you have to add noise proportional to that. So let me show you here. This is kind of what I claim this is private. I'm not going to prove it for you, but I claim the following is private, where you take your data set, you average it, and then you add Gaussian noise proportional to, with standard deviation, delta over epsilon n, where delta is the sensitivity of the summation. So let's just unpack this a bit. Again, delta is the sensitivity of how much you can change this summation, which means if you take one point and change it to another point, how much the sum will change. Let me remind you that epsilon is a privacy parameter. If it confuses you, then you can just think of it as, say, like 1. 1 is a usually reasonable thing to think of. And that n is, again, the number of samples. So now maybe if you understand the setting, you'll see what the big, what the problem is going to be. What is the sensitivity of summation of xi, where xi's are just some heights? I'll let you think about this for a second. Maybe there's no way for you to like shout it out, but what is the sensitivity of the summation? If you just take one height and you change it to something else, how much can it change by? I'll pause for a sec for you to think about it at least before I give away the answer. And the tricky part is that if you just have some heights, then the sensitivity can be very, very large. Imagine you take one height and you change it to 1.8 times 10 to the 308, like, the biggest number you can fit on a computer within whatever floating point or something. The point is this would totally decimate your signal. The reason is that, recall that we're adding noise proportional to the sensitivity divided by n. So the noise you would add here would just totally dwarf the signal, and you would not get a useful answer at all. So therefore, it seems like the first shot at trying to solve these types of problems using the standard tools in differential privacy won't work, just because the sensitivity of these statistics is unbounded. Now, of course, you might be thinking, this is really, really silly. Like, I saw one point which is that big. Obviously, that's not a real person's height. I know what heights are like. Well, can we do anything to solve that? And that's kind of, you have the intuition, and that's right, and that'll give you a first glance in terms of trying to improve this problem. It's not going to be the final answer, but yeah, we're basically going to use what we know about what heights look like in order to improve things. So a priori, being perhaps generous on both ends, we're going to say most females are between 120 centimeters and 200 centimeters. If we see anything outside that range, perhaps this is an outlier, or an adversary is trying to mess with our data set, or something like this. So what we can do is we can clip or Winsorize the data set. Winsorize, I guess, is a stats term, to delta equals 80. That is, if anyone is outside these ranges, outside of 120 to 200, what we do is we just round the point to the closest endpoint of this interval. So now we've reduced the sensitivity statistic dramatically, because if you had a point which was way out there, 1.8 times 10 to the 308, well, with this, if we do this operation first, it's going to reduce it's going to just be clipped to this point. So therefore, we've reduced the sensitivity a lot down to 80. And now you can see that we're adding just some noise, which is of standard deviation, 80 divided by epsilon n. So this is a lot better than, say, real max divided by epsilon n. But it's still pretty bad. You tell any statistician that, oh yeah, we're going to add 80 over n noise to your statistic, they'll tell you to get lost. This is not going to be useful. This will just drown out too much of their signal. Not useful, not a good tool. So this is really just a starting point. This is like a naive starting point. And the goal is really going to be minimizing the cost due to uncertainty. Cool. So this is just like a first algorithm. I've described it to you in words, but let me try to give you an idea of how the analysis works. I'll go over this relatively quickly. So because people who might get something out of it maybe already kind of know this stuff, or people who don't might want to gloss over it. So let's just go through this relatively quickly, how just to see the underlying math. So suppose we have some data set x1 through xn, which is drawn from some Gaussian. This is kind of like like I said, for now, we're going to focus on the Gaussian case. Just because it's nice and well behaved. I can talk about how things change when it's not so well behaved. But basically, we have a data set from a Gaussian with unknown mean and variance 1. And we also have the restriction here, which is new to the private setting. We have to know that the mean is less than or equal to R. Well, why do we have to know this? This is kind of similar to what I was saying in the previous slide. We knew that most females are between 120 to 200 centimeters in height. Well, that kind of tells what we know about our data before we even see it. So similarly, here, we have to know something about our distribution. In particular, we're going to say that, okay, we have some sort of rough handle on where the mean lies. Doesn't have to be perfect. Maybe R can be very large, but it's some sort of grasp on it. I'll say that there's a private algorithm which will estimate the mean to accuracy right here. And there's two terms here in terms of how well we approximate things. The first term will be what is known as the non-private rate. Say, if you didn't have differential privacy, this would be how well you can do it. I'll go into the analysis in the next slide a bit, but this is the non-private cost. But then the additional cost you have to pay due to privacy is the latter term. You'll note that this is a faster rate, what statisticians would call a faster rate, because it decays faster depending on n. As n increases, this dies faster. But on the other hand, you have this big R sitting on top. So you'll see that if R is small, this might be pretty small. But if R is large, then we could pay a lot due to privacy. And equivalently, I'll say that if you want to estimate the distribution in total variation distance, then this is the sample complexity. It's basically just saying that to estimate to accuracy alpha, you need 1 over alpha squared samples, plus this is the additional cost of privacy in the second term, R over alpha epsilon. So this is the theorem statement. Are there any questions? The main thing I want to get across here, that if you get one thing out of this slide, really, the additional cost of privacy is this term here, which decays faster depending on n, but if R is large, then it could be significant. In the interest of time, because I want to focus on maybe some more experimental results toward the end, I'm going to skip over the analysis. To anyone who knows kind of how these sorts of things work, it's basically a Chernoff and Chebyshev type bound in order to bound the empirical error. And then in terms of the bounding the magnitude of the noise, that's not hard just because we have pretty good tail bounds on Gaussians. So basically just accounting for the error due to clipping, which is 0, and then accounting for the error due to sampling, which is by Chernoff or Chebyshev, and then basically summing these three sources of error, you'll get that we have this as the error. But okay, let's skip over the analysis, and instead we're going to focus on perhaps, sorry, yeah, there's one question. Let me take a question as to, yeah, there's one question here asking, is there any intuition as to why higher R causes more privacy cost? Yeah, that's a great question. Let me take a step back and actually try to address this a bit more. It kind of says what does R represent? It really says how much knowledge do we have as the data set as an analyst about the data set as an analyst? For example, a small R is really saying we have a pretty good guess already about what the parameter is. But for example, in this heights, we had a lot of information. We kind of know what humans look like in terms of their height. On the other hand, you could imagine maybe you're someone working in a bio lab and you've done all sorts of weird analysis on your data, and now it's like in a very weird representation, and you have no idea. It could be, say, it could be on the order of 1 to 2, or maybe it's between 1 to 10 to the minus 5, between 10 to the minus 5 and between 10 to the 5. So sometimes you just don't even have any idea what your data looks like. this is kind of encoded by this parameter R. Yeah, so like you can think of R as being a representation of how much we know. A small r means we already know a lot about the distribution. A large R means we don't really know too much of the distribution a priori. And it turns out you have to know something about your distribution beforehand. Otherwise, differential privacy, we have lower bound saying that you can't do anything. There's some details about different privacy models, which I'm going to elide for now, but we can talk about it offline if anyone's interested. Okay, so again, yeah, let's skip over the baseline analysis. And so I described this basic algorithm. Let me just recall what the basic algorithm is. Like, I don't want to. Yeah, I don't want to go too much into the technical details of how things work, but the baseline algorithm I'll describe. In fact, yeah, let me just remind you what it is. Basically, take your data set, clamp the data, making sure that no point is too large or too small, and then add noise proportional to how wide that is, and that's it. Output the result. So I'm going to show you how just basically one simple tweak on top of that will give us a more powerful algorithm and let us do a lot better. In particular, it's going to give us an exponential improvement in terms of the dependence on this parameter R. So, okay, recall our setting. I'm going to try to describe what our setting is in the most general possible terms. So we have x1 through xn, which is distributed according to some distribution p. Where for now we're pretending that p is, say, Gaussian for simplicity. What we need to start, it's kind of a minimal assumption we need, is that we have some confidence interval for the mean of this distribution with coverage 1. So this is a fancy way of saying, like, this is maybe what a statistician would say. We just know that the parameter mu, the mean, is between -r and r. So that's one thing we need. We need to sort of, like I said, a starting bound in terms of where the mean lies. And the second thing we need is that we need the ability to compute non-private confidence intervals for p. So that is, yeah, this kind of a common thing that we can do. In particular, for Gaussians, we understand how to compute confidence intervals very, very well. That is, say, like you take a bunch of samples from a Gaussian and you take the sort of empirical mean of it, then we know how close that empirical mean is going to be to the true mean. These are just generalization bounds, maybe you might call it, but yeah, confidence intervals is kind of the terminology in this setting. So, like I said, the algorithm before is very simple. It's the first two steps of this. One is that we windsorize or clip or clamp your data. These are all essentially the same thing. So you clip your data, and then you compute a noise mean, where the noise is proportional to how wide this interval you're clipping to is. And then the third step is that the sort of new thing in our approach is that this actually gives you a new confidence interval for the mean, and then you iterate. So this might be a bit confusing, but let me try to illustrate as clearly as possible in this example, the exact same example. Let me say that if you understand what I'm doing in this next like little animation, then you'll understand the talk. Like you got the main idea. I think it's fairly simple in the end. So okay, this is the setting. Recall that we have some heights. And the first thing we do is clip or windsorize our data, saying anything outside these two goalposts is going to be moved to the nearest one. The next thing we do is we add noise. So we compute the mean, and then we add noise. So you can see here's an estimate of the true mean is somewhere right here around 160, let's say. But due to the noise, it ends up maybe closer to 170. So that's not the best estimate of the mean. It's kind of got a lot of noise present. But the really cool thing, so that's the classic algorithm up to this point. But the new thing about our approach is the following. Based on where this noise mean lies, we can actually say something about where the true mean lies. Because how did we get from this true mean into this noise mean? Well, what we did was we have two sources of error, recall. One source of error is due to the sampling, and another is due to the noise addition. Well, we understand both of those terms very well in the sense that we know that the data set is Gaussian, and we know also that the noise we add is Gaussian. So since we know what those two distributions look like, we can actually say that, honestly, because we got a mean which is a noise mean which is here, it means that the true mean is somewhere within these two tighter purple bars. So you can see we started with a very wide confidence interval for where the mean lies. But by doing a step of this, we got tighter confidence intervals. And now we have a bit more information. To draw an analogy to go back to the R parameter, in some sense, R has decreased. So that's great. And in fact, we can just iterate. Now that's all we do. We just basically iterate this procedure. So now we have this tighter confidence interval. We take an empirical mean of the points within it and add noise. And now you can see we get a kind of better estimate of the mean. So like I said, this is it. This is the whole approach. There's nothing more than that. It's very simple. If you understood this, then congratulations, you got the idea. Yeah, this is in a result with my co-author that I mentioned, which was at Europe 2020. Let me pause for perhaps an awkwardly long time so that people can ask any questions they might have, because if you got this, then you're golden.
So just a quick question from my side, actually.
Yeah.
So is the noise that you're adding in all the iterative steps constant, or it's like randomly sampled at each iteration?
Great question. Yeah, the thing is, when you're doing differential privacy, every time you ask a new question, you really have to add new noise. So yeah, you have to sample a new Gaussian noise at each of these steps. Good question. Cool. Anyone else? I feel like I made it sufficiently awkward during the previous break, so let's continue. Like I said, I like awkward pauses at these times. Okay, so let me tell you perhaps the theorem statement so we can see quantitatively how this really compares to the previous statement. So again, this is essentially the same setup as before. This time I said we have a general sigma squared. It doesn't really matter. You can pretend sigma squared equals 1 if you want. Then it's the exact same setting as before. I'll claim that there exists a private algorithm, which outputs a confidence interval for the mean. So we know at the end that the mean lies between L and R. And we have this funny type of bound here. Like let's see what this is. So if we have that n is greater than square root log R over epsilon, then the width of this confidence interval will be something like the following. So let me just contrast this with what we had before. Before, I claim that this is essentially the exact same thing we had. We had this 1 over square root n. So this is a non-private rate. It's still there. But the second term here is the cost of privacy. So let's write this as sample complexity because I think it's easier to tell the difference between how it was before. So again, in terms of the sample complexity to get accuracy alpha, there's 3 terms. The first term is really the non-private cost. We're never getting rid of this. This is kind of what we'd always expect, even in the non-private setting. Now, remember that before we had the second term being R over alpha epsilon. Well, what we've done here is we've removed the R from this term. So now it's just 1 over alpha epsilon. But now we've introduced a third term, which is square root log R divided by epsilon. So the sort of key salient point here is the fact that we've decrease the dependence on R from linear to square root log. So let me just say that this is an exponential improvement, like basically an exponential improvement in the dependence on this parameter, which is actually very, very important and causes a huge difference in practice, especially if you're an analyst who doesn't have like very strong ideas of where your data lies already. Cool. So are there questions about this theorem statement, or is it maybe, hopefully, again, it's clear in terms of how this differs from the previous one. We've decreased the cost in R by an exponential factor. Sure. So there's one question in the chat. What changes in your method if the data is not IID? And supposing we're interested in some notion of group DP. Okay, so these are 2 different questions. Let me answer the first one first. What changes in your method if the data is not IID? So at least the nice part in terms of like if you just want to run this algorithm, you have non-IID data, that's still fine. I mean, it won't necessarily give you the same theoretical guarantees. It'll still give you privacy. And that's kind of like the power of the setup I said before, where we never sacrifice on privacy, even for worst case data. So we'll still guarantee privacy. In terms of accuracy, well, even in non-private settings, it's not always clear what happens if you're not IID. So like, in short, to answer that question, things will still work. You can still run it, and you'll still have privacy. Accuracy is kind of depending on your data. Maybe something goes wrong, but maybe if you know something about the IID structure of your data, maybe you can exploit that and make a better algorithm. But otherwise, the same thing works. The second question is, supposing we're interested in some notion of group DP. I suppose that means if many people change their data at once. Well, the really beautiful thing about one of the reasons why differential privacy is so appreciated and beloved by many is the fact that it really has these properties just sort of out of the box. If you can guarantee just this notion of differential privacy I said, you get the same type of notion that you might expect for group differential privacy. And this is sort of in a black box manner. Great questions. Are there any other questions? Cool. Let me proceed. Like I said, I'm going to skip over, like here's a description of the algorithm, which I could go through in more detail, but in the interest of time and to get to some other stuff, I'll skip over it. It's a fairly simple algorithm. It's like, yeah, basically 5 or 6 lines, and that's about it. But it requires just setting some parameters in the right way. We could talk about this offline if you're curious. And I have a slide or two on the analysis, but again, I'll skip it. It's fairly simple. Let me just comment. I think this is an important thing that I want to get across. I want to talk about prior approaches. So one thing that's really popular in one dimension is to use private histograms. For example, there's the work of Karwa and Vadan in ITCS 2018, which is really excellent, which uses kind of a private histogram method, which I won't get into. But like the main thing that I want to get across about private histograms is histograms in general. If you try to bin your data somehow, then this works great in one dimension. But it really doesn't work well in higher dimensions because you'll pay an exponential cost in the dimensionality because you kind of have to cover each dimension in some independent way. And this doesn't scale well in D, it'll scale exponentially. So that doesn't really work super well in that case. Other things depend on quantile-based methods, including this resultative do-it-all. But again, that's also not great because it's not really clear what you should consider in high dimensional settings. So while they're great in univariate settings, high dimensions are not great and maybe assume some sort of symmetry. So on the other hand, we have our basically what I said, the exact same algorithm works in the multivariate setting. I stated theorem here, but let me just show you this picture, which I think gets across most of the idea. It's essentially the exact same thing as before. Maybe in a first step, you start with a very big ball of a lot of uncertainty in where your data lies. You run it for an iteration. Then it becomes more narrow because you can shrink your ball, and then you do it again. Eventually, you'll have some sort of uncertainty, which is fairly narrowly concentrated around your true data set. And at that point, you can run this naive algorithm just where you just clip noise and average your data, and that's it. So this is basically the multivariate setting in one picture, shrinking this ball. That's about it. I'll skip over the description of the algorithm just because it's essentially the same thing as I had a few slides ago, except the changes are in red. It's basically just changing parameters, but the same approach still works. Okay, let me just show you a few plots and a few experiments. Like this is maybe my third last slide that I'll talk about, second last slide, let's say. So I just want to show you how well it works compared to, say, non-private methods and say better than everything else. So this is in like 50 dimensions. The x-axis here is the number of samples. And you can see a few different approaches that we compare here. You can think of this blue as the baseline, the non-private accuracy. If you just take the empirical mean, how well does it do? And that's kind of, nothing's going to do better than that. And you can see our approach is this red t=2 line, which basically tracks this non-private accuracy super closely, especially compared to everything else. And in fact, if you just compare us with the best competitor, this is sort of just zooming in and taking their excess loss in compared to the non-private estimate. And you can see that there's really like ours is kind of a lot better in terms of the accuracy. And all the code is available online. We have some additional experiments in a lower dimensional setting, it's 2 dimensions, and higher dimensions, say 500 dimensions, we work a lot better with minimal prior info. But let me skip all of this and just give you one more experiment that I'll show because I think this is a really cool takeaway. essentially, our approach also works for problems involving PCA. So let me just tell you real quickly about this really nice study called Genes Mere Geography Within Europe, which maybe some of you have heard about. The idea is this is from a study of November et al., which said the researchers did the following experiment. They took a genetic data set from individuals in Europe. They labeled each individual with their country of origin and say, gave them a color. For example, if they're from Spain, then they're colored blue. And this high dimensional genomic data set, they did the following experiment on it. They essentially took the PCA of it, took the top two components, and plotted the data in the plane, projected onto these top two components. So, and in fact, you can see the picture here on the left, the series of dots, that's the non-private projection. That is essentially what you can see it pretty closely resembles the map of Europe, and they found the sort of interpretation of this is that the top two directions, which explain most of the variance in genetics in Europe, correspond to latitude and longitude, thus saying that genes mirror geography. And this was kind of really cool because I don't know, it's nice to see that you can find some visualizations in the data which are not really, which are not really, it's not obvious that they would be there in the first place. So now the caveat here is that this is a private data set involving genetics. So maybe somehow when doing this type of statistic, you leaked someone's information. So the idea is that we'd like to do the same type of estimation, except with privacy. Now, if you use naive methods, you can see the result here. Europe is destroyed. Now, this is just a naive method, but if you use our method, you can see if you run, say, more and more iterations of this type of approach, you get something which starts to look more like Europe. And in the end, you get something which pretty closely resembles the original map of Europe, except it's computed privately. So yeah, you can play around with our code if you want. It's all available. And I think this gives hope for private exploratory data analysis with this method. Okay, so with that, let me just wrap up and say we gave a generic method for private estimation where it's really just can be described in these 3 steps, 4 steps, I guess, if you include repeat. You just clip your data set, compute a non-private estimator, you account for the noise, and then you repeat. And that's it. It's applicable to a bunch of different settings. And I'm happy to take any questions now. Thanks.
Thank you, Gautam, for the great talk. I request anyone if has any questions, kindly unmute yourself and feel free to ask. Yeah, I think everyone has the.
Cool. I see one.
Everyone's
Q&A.
allowed. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a great question. Do you consider the effect of clipping when calculating the error? This is a really great question. The reason is because for the, like I said during this talk, we're focusing on the Gaussian case. And in the Gaussian case, things are pretty nice in the sense that you don't have to, because you can clip very tightly and the Gaussians are very nicely concentrated, and it doesn't typically affect things in the end. However, if you're in, say, a heavier tailed setting, say maybe all you have on your data is a bounded second moment assumption, then you actually do have to deal with this. And there's a certain trade-off in terms of the amount of bias due to clipping, as well as the noise you add. This isn't explored in this paper, but I'd recommend another paper, but with myself, Vikram Singhal and John Ullman, which was in Colt last year, which explicitly addresses this type of thing. Super insightful question, though. Great. Thanks.
There is a question in the chat window, Gautam.
Oh, cool. I didn't see the chat. Cool. Let's see. The question asking, am I right to expect that this approach might not have the same theoretical guarantees for robust location estimators? That's a great question in the sense that these approaches, this is a really interesting question, one that I've thought to some degree about. Understanding there's such, it just generally seems like there's very close relationship between the definitions of robustness and privacy, because they both try to account for how much changing one point will affect your data, or changing a set of points will affect your estimator. But the thing is, in terms of technical connections, at least here in particular, it doesn't seem like the same tools directly apply. So yeah, like if it depends on what you mean by a robust location estimator, but at least in terms of the way I usually think of robustness, where you can change like a constant fraction of your points, it doesn't give. Oh, okay. You're asking a somewhat different question. Let me finish this, and then I can talk about that. Let me just say that it's not immediately applicable for like the most robust type settings, for example, especially in multivariate settings. But there is a paper, a very recent paper, which actually tries to address both of these questions at the same time in terms of robustness as well as privacy at the same time. Now, let me say for this question in terms of the median, do the exact same things work? Not the exact same things. Let me say, not the exact same approach doesn't necessarily work for the median because it can have a higher sensitivity. There are ways of privately computing the median. In particular, there was a paper actually also at NeurIPS this past year, which tries to do similar sorts of things and gives an analysis for that case. But you're right, it's not, you can get essentially the same theoretical guarantees, but there's different algorithms which do it. Great question. Yeah, no problem.
So one question from my side, Gautam. So the way we measure differential privacy of an algorithm or a model is by the notion of this epsilon bounds. And is that the measure that we say, okay, the algorithm is epsilon differentially private or something like that?
Yeah, exactly. Like differential privacy is parameterized by an epsilon. Maybe I should have said this earlier. Sorry, I apologize. But like essentially a smaller epsilon corresponds to a more private algorithm, and a larger epsilon corresponds to a less private algorithm. So for example, any algorithm you run, if it's not with privacy, will have epsilon equals infinity differential privacy sort of by default. And the algorithm which just outputs a constant, it ignores your data, that will give you epsilon equals 0 differential privacy. Obviously, both of these are deficient in various aspects. So generally, we try to get something which lies between the two. It gives you something which is both useful as well as private in some sense. But there's of course a trade-off here.
Awesome. So if we don't have any other questions, I would like to ask some journey and research process questions to you, Gautam.
Yeah, happy to answer them.
Yeah. So I guess the first question is like, can you just talk a little bit about your journey and like what motivated you to work in differential privacy and like what motivated you to become a professor?
Yeah, great question. I guess like how did I get here? I guess I started from I guess it really started during undergrad, where I had done like maybe some experience software engineering, which I thought was okay, but I just personally didn't find certain aspects of it super engrossing. Whereas in comparison, I found like the type of stuff I'd learned in school. I just generally, I think I was driven mostly by intellectual curiosity, just like wanting to know how things work, trying to understand and really build up an understanding of things that are at the sort of frontiers of knowledge, let's say. How did I end up in sort of the space of, say, trustworthy ML? Generally, I like, again, I come from a kind of theoretical background, a theoretical training. And it's interesting how it actually came first. I started, before I got into privacy, I guess I started in robustness. And the way I got into robustness was actually via a very like kind of technical question in terms of trying to understand central limit theorems for various multivariate distributions. And somehow there was like a key technical question about like related to the question, can we estimate, say, a Gaussian distribution when, say, 90% of its data is Gaussian, but maybe 10% is adversarially placed? So this is like a very basic question. And I looked around, like I thought, oh, there must definitely be a solution for this. But there wasn't, and we basically solved this for the next like 2 or 3 years during my PhD studies. And as for privacy, I guess like it just seemed like very basic questions in this area had not been properly addressed. So I feel like there was really just, it felt like obvious things that we should know, but we didn't know. And so that sort of drove me to try to figure out, okay, well, how do we, what do we know? Yeah, I'd say just mostly curiosity is what led me down this path, and just wanting to understand why something happens and what the right answer is, how things change.
I see. Yeah, that's great. So I think my last question would be like, what are your thoughts on trustworthy ML in general and its future? Like, what do you think the landscape will look like?
That's a fantastic question in the sense that like this has been just such a it's great to see that there's so much interest in this field over like the last couple of years. Like I think okay, let me say that some of these things are quite classic. For example, if you talk about robustness, I'd say this goes back to maybe I think the 50s or even before that, where say Peter Huber, he had his book on robust statistics and stuff. But say over the last decade or even like 5 years, there's just been so much interest and so much excitement in it. I think I feel like there's been a lot of work in it, and I'm really curious to see what really sticks in the sense that I feel like some of these ideas are going to prove to be very let's see, in robustness at least, let me say, I feel like some of the ideas are going to maybe survive the test of time and will sort of define how the field will go in the future, but it's hard to tell beforehand. In terms of privacy, I guess this is very interesting, especially given how these types of differentially private methods are being more used in practice nowadays. In particular, like I said, there's been deployments of differential privacy at Microsoft, Google, Facebook has sort of used it in some certain types of things. But the biggest one, I think, is actually, this is going to be monumental for the field, is going to be the 2020 census, the US Census, which is including differential privacy in its deployment. In particular, a lot of social scientists are very concerned about how will this affect our data, our accuracy of our statistics, and also things like there's even been a legal challenge. For example, the state of Alabama is currently trying to, I don't know, sue someone, either the government or the Census Bureau, basically saying that this differential privacy should not be used in the census. So it's really interesting, I think, to see how all of these things play out and how that will affect our expectations of privacy in the future, and how I think the public perception of privacy and data privacy will go forward. Maybe we'll have to somehow readjust, and it might mean that people will have to pivot in terms of how they study and what type of desiderata they want in these sorts of things.
Nice. Nice. So I guess with that, since we don't have any other questions, I'd like to share, I guess I'll thank again Gautam for the talk. And we'll be taking a short break for now, and we'll be reconvening at 1:05 ET for a participant discussion. Kindly join there for an intriguing discussion on differential privacy or like all other different aspects of trustworthy ML. And with that, I would like to announce that our upcoming seminar, which is on April 15th, we'll be having Suresh Venkatesh Subramanian, who's a professor at University of Utah. And with that, we'll take a break, and I'll thank Gautam again. Feel free to stay by or leave if you want for the participant discussion.
Sure, yeah, I think I might try to drop by the participant discussion
Sure.
in case there's interest. But yeah, again, thanks a lot for hosting me. This is a really great initiative, and thanks for running it.
Thanks, Gautam.